So a couple of things before we start. Um, Before we start, Elliot. Well, let me say. Hold on, everyone, guys. Um, Let me say I just sent a B Courses announcement about this, but there's some live streaming difficulties, something I have to do with the Wi-Fi in the building.
It's Airbears too.
So what we're doing instead is we're just recording this, and I'll post it right after class. Okay. So if anyone else that you know in class text you and say what the hell's going on, just say that I wrote everyone this, but just say that it'll be available right after class. And if anyone, if someone wants to, record it, do whatever you want. That's generally fine with me. Before we go any further, I know Elliot wants to announce something. No.
Really, I'm just apologising.
Oh.
I had access to my computer earlier in the weekend, so I've not replied to any emails.
Okay.
Which has been really liberating for me. Not very nice for anyone who emailed me, so that's why I haven't responded, and I will respond today.
Okay. So yeah, just to confirm, Elliot had computer troubles over the weekend, so he'll be responding to emails today. Okay. So today, what we're primarily so as you can see and tell from the lack of helicopters overhead, the Free Speech Week. Obviously, a lot happened over the weekend, and it is no longer happening. And whatever meager thing happened on Sprawl yesterday happened. So I think both for folks who are here and folks who are listening at home or will be listening at home in some other time, we can probably continue class just as usual on Wednesday. Okay. Let me say quickly one thing about the papers. Just a couple of I want to kind of keep that in your mind. I talked a little bit last time about the importance of leaving yourself enough time to do 2 drafts. Okay, which is to say to really whatever you do to write a draft, whether it's sitting down for 4 hours and just typing everything that you can think of and then kind of figuring out what you have, or whether you do a whole lot of kind of pre-writing work, taking notes, making sketches, resketching the sketches, whatever it is, you want to leave yourself time to do that first stage of the process, and then to be able to look at that first stage again and rewrite it. Okay, one of the hardest things, at least just speaking for me, but it may be the case for Diana, Elliot, and Hannah as well, one of the difficult things to do is when someone comes in to talk about their paper and says something like, well, I'm going to write about X, is that okay? Does that sound good? Right? It's sort of this kind of, I don't know, right? You sort of, there's a way in which you want, the desire is for me or your GSI is to kind of give a check plus to the thesis that you haven't yet done yet. Right, so it's hard to make real comments about something that doesn't quite exist yet, right? And so what's often more productive, I think, is when you at least have a few sentences that you can that if you do come in to talk to your GSI or me, that you then say, here's what I'm working with. Can we go from there? Okay, and this is all simply to say, do the best you can to kind of get going on the writing process. I know many of you already have. Many of you came in to talk to me on Friday about the drafts that are already either fully existing or kind of on their way to fully existing. And let me say one other thing about the papers. I think it's especially crucial, it's always crucial, but it's especially crucial for this class, that in your papers you stick closely to the text that you're working with. Okay? I think there's going to be the desire and the danger that we both, in class itself and in any written work, is to kind of immediately go to the largest level of abstraction. Right? Like, to get sort of the answer about music and poetry as, twin pillars of the universe or something like that. And I think that is not going to generally, and it hasn't for seasoned scholars who have done this their whole lives, that doesn't yield really compelling work. Okay, so I think the thing that you can do to help yourself out is to really stick closely to the text that you're working with. Right? Be interested in concrete details of the sort that you are interested in as literary critics, scholars, and so forth, right? Perspective, image, rhyme, rhythm, any of those things. It's not just because this class is kind of floating around music and poetry and music and literature, don't give up on that kind of active close reading that you've learned to do in other classes and that you continue to do, okay? So I would say, especially stick closely to the text for these papers, especially because they're so short, the papers themselves. Okay. Before we start on the material for the day, any questions about the papers or about things coming up?
Formatting question. Should we just include like your name and the GSI's name beside each other? We've done this before.
It doesn't matter to me. I mean, like, do you guys have, in terms of formatting, like a heading, as long as your name is on it, we'll figure it out. But I mean, yes, it's nice if you put the GSI's name and my name. That's. I mean, my name is actually less important.
Okay. Right.
As long as you put the GSI's name, that's fine.
Okay.
Diana and Elliot, are you guys planning to? How are you going to how do you want the papers? Electronically or paper? Hard copy for you? Okay, so your GSI will let you know what form they want you to hand the paper in, okay? So it sounds like for Diana and Elliot, it'll be in hard copies, and Hannah will either let you know or has already let you know if you're in her section, okay? Any more questions about the paper? 12-point font is great. Like 8-point, then I'm getting old. 16-point, and I feel like I have to bring out my crayons. So 12-point is good. I like the usual margins, like not the margin of the Cather. Looks like these beautiful 4-inch margins in this thing. Okay, so otherwise, I'm pretty. I don't have a particular font that you need to use or anything like that. Okay, so what we're interested in today, I know that last week with Wagner and with all that was going on, it was chaotic and hectic, and I presented a whole bunch of information about lots of things. And so what I want to do, for a number of reasons, is kind of pull back today and kind of think about maybe what we might say is the kind of flip side of some of the stuff that we've been thinking about in previous weeks. Okay. What we're interested in today, or what we're going to be looking at today, are these kind of 3 scenes of listening. Okay, the 2 stories that are on the syllabus for today, the Cather story and the wolf story, each do something right that we've seen done before in various ways in this class, which is they present a scene of formalized listening. Right, both of these stories take place at a venue during a concert. Okay, so I want to think first about the Cather and then about the wolf, and on the one hand, how music is working in a kind of narrative form, because we haven't really looked at narrative forms yet. I mean, in terms of fiction, right? We've mostly looked at poetry and a handful of kind of essays and things like that. So I want to think about how music is working in this narrative form, but I also want to think about how these different stories, how we can understand them as kind of theorizations of what it means to listen, right? How we listen in different ways in different kinds of contexts, okay? So those are the first 2 scenes of listening that I want to kind of think about. The third one is our own scene of listening when we deal with the Mallarmé Debussy, okay? We're going to kind of, we didn't get to the Mallarmé Debussy last time. In certain ways, it goes well with the Stravinsky that we're going to do on Wednesday, and it kind of continues to go well with some of the stuff that we do next week with Elliot. But I do think, even, saying, kind of the caveat first, there's so much to talk about with the Mallarmé poem and the Debussy piece. There's whole books have been written about the single poem and the piece. So we won't get into everything. But I do think this presents a really interesting challenge and problem for us when we ask what it means to listen to this piece of music, okay, which was written with some relation to a previously existing poem. Okay, so what I want to think about in that third scene is, what does it mean for us to listen to that piece, knowing this poem, and thinking about how they're related? Okay, and there's always a chance that that third portion may get pushed to Wednesday, but remember, the only thing you have to do for Wednesday is listen to a bit of Stravinsky, Rite of Spring, which is like good paper writing music. So it's probably not great paper, but it'll work. Okay. So tell me what happens. Cather's story is about what? It's on page 1. No, it's not. I think I have two page numbers. What page of the reader? 92. So a Wagner matinee is about what? Just give me the plot. Yeah, we've got Clark, a young man living in Boston. His aunt Georgiana, who's living in Nebraska, where Clark used to live. She comes to Boston to settle a relative's will, and she stays with him at his own kind of boarding house, his own kind of apartment or flat. And she takes it, or he takes her to. He wants to kind of, show her the city, which she once used to live in, and he takes her to a concert. Okay, it's relatively straightforward. There's not a whole lot of plot there. Okay. The Wagner performances like this were very common of Wagner's music. As we talked about before, Wagner had these massive music dramas with casts, scenery, big orchestras. Those are expensive to put on. Okay, so one of the ways that Wagner's music tended to travel and be performed the most, both throughout Europe, in England, and in the United States in the latter half of the 19th century, is in these kind of abbreviated concert performances. So what they're seeing here is not, or what they're watching and listening to, is not a fully staged version of any one of these operas. It's just excerpts and bits, overtures, and kind of pieces from a handful of different operas. Okay, so it's this kind of like anthology of Wagner music that lasts, that lasts the length of a concert. Okay. One of the first things to say is that it seems like every kind of thing in the story is mediated in some fashion by music, right? Either the music that they actually hear during the performance, or the music that Clark kind of remembers them hearing or listening to when he was a child living in Nebraska. Okay. So let me ask first, what can we say? But let me ask you a different question first. This is a strange story in certain ways, because what person is this story and what perspective is it in? Just in terms of narrative. First person. Okay. One of the things that often happens in first person, think of the novels that you know in first person, the stories first person, is that we are getting obviously the first person perspective of a narrator, and oftentimes that narrator is also the protagonist. Right? Call me Ishmael. Ishmael is both the protagonist in many ways, apart from the kind of quasi-antagonist Ahab, and obviously the narrator. Okay? There's a weird thing that happens in this story because Clark narrates the story. The only reason we know his name is Clark is because she refers to him as Clark. He doesn't say call me Clark, but he's the first person narrator of this story. But whose story is this? Who is this story about? His aunt. Right, so we have this weird, oftentimes what happens in first-person narratives is that anything like readerly sympathy, empathy, interest pools around the first-person narrator, because that narrator is also the protagonist. Here we have a kind of division, right, where Clark is the narrator, but Georgiana is really the kind of the main character, the protagonist, right? And what music ends up doing, right, is almost giving Clark a mechanism for understanding and then presenting what he takes to be his aunt's emotional reaction to the music. Okay? Was anyone struck? So if we just look at the text itself, she arrives in Boston. She's totally kind of flummoxed, and she's tired and etc. We get a background of her life on page 490 of the story. This continues into 491. The beginning of the story, the beginning of the concert starts at around bottom of 491, 492. One of the things to notice first is that we get something that we often get in this story, often get in these kinds of texts that mediate music and literature, is that a third art form is brought in to do the job, right? And so if we think about what happens on page 492, when they get to the concert itself, okay, the matinee audience was made up chiefly of women, One lost the contour of faces and figures, indeed any effective line whatever, and there was only the color of bodices past counting, the shimmer of fabric soft and firm, silky and sheer, red, mauve, pink, blue, lilac, purple, ecru, rose, yellow, cream, and white, all the colors that an impressionist finds in a sunlit landscape, with here and there the dead shadow of a frock coat. My Georgiana regarded them as though they had been so many daubs of tube paint on a palette. Right? So what happens first is that this musical concert is presented to us as a kind of tableau vivant, or a kind of painting, right? And so we have this third artistic form coming in to kind of mediate the other two. Music comes out, the musicians come out, take their places. Our narrator Clark is engaged with kind of some heavy breathing description of the orchestra, the clean profiles of the musicians. This is top of 493. The gloss of their linen, the dull backs of their coats, the beloved shapes of the instruments, the patches of yellow light and smooth varnished bellies of the cellos and bass viols in the rear, the restless wind-tossed forest of fiddledecks and bows. Again, we have another kind of visualization of the orchestra. I recalled how in the first orchestra I ever heard, those long bow strokes seemed to draw the heart out of me, as a conjurer's stick reels out yards of paper ribbon from a hat. And then we get the first number of the Tannhauser Overture. All of the pieces that are mentioned in this, all of the Wagner pieces that are mentioned in this story, I've linked to Bee Horses, so you can listen to all of them if you want. What happens if you just take a look at 493 into 494? What happens when the music starts? His aunt has been kind of a wreck. He basically says, you know, I shouldn't have taken her because I want her to just stay asleep until she goes back to Nebraska. What happens when the music starts?
He starts watching her in really strange attention to detail and notes her reactions to the music.
So that's exactly right. The whole story becomes this kind of second order listening, right? We have these two listeners listening to the piece. Well, we have lots of listeners, but we only have, for the story's sake, Clark and Georgiana. Georgiana clearly, she was a musician in her past. She's never seen. He asked her, "Have you ever seen?" At the bottom of 491, I asked her whether she had ever heard of any of the Wagnerian operas, and she said she had not, though she was perfectly familiar with their respective situations and had once possessed the piano score of the Flying Dutchman. Right? So she knows some of the tunes. She knows some of the plots, but she's never obviously seen a Wagnerian opera, right? But we know that she also lived in Boston and was a kind of a music student and teacher ages ago. So what happens is this weird kind of double listening, or double engagement. On the one hand, she is listening intensely to the music. He is kind of listening to the music, but really just kind of watching her, right? And what happens when he watches her is really kind of interesting, because one of the things that's really interesting to kind of think through and track is that we have very little actual knowledge of what she's thinking or what she's feeling. She never gets to speak, right? I mean, or her speech is reported through the first person narration of Clark. She very rarely gets to say anything, right? But a lot of what the story is about are her reactions to the music, which we only have through Clark's perspective, right? So we have this kind of, I mean, you know, we can think about this in the Wordsworthian terms of appropriation, right? But we also have this kind of weird structure of listening happening, where the one thing that he seems to be not doing is listening to the actual music, right? And if you just look at page 493, we get the kind of first moment in this kind of listening. The first number was the Tannhauser Overture. When the horns drew out the first strain of the Pilgrim's Chorus and Georgiana clutched my coat sleeve, then it was I first realized that for her this broke a silence of 30 years. With the battle between the two motives, with the frenzy of the Venusberg theme and its ripping of strings, there came to me an overwhelming sense of the waste and wear we are so powerless to combat. Right? So the first thing he does is respond for himself. And I saw again the tall, naked house on the prairie, black and grim as a wooden fortress. And then we get a kind of substitution or a kind of diversion from the music itself and whatever it makes him feel to memories of the house in Nebraska where he grew up. The black conway I'd learned to swim, and then the rest of the paragraph is not about the music or about the Pilgrim score. It's about Tannhauser or about anything like that. But it's him kind of tracking back, tunneling back into his own memory of his childhood, right? So what music does here is provide not really any definitive link to his past, right? We know it's not that he says, well, I've heard this before, back in my childhood, and I'm hearing it again now. But just this kind of the place, the music kind of acts as it licenses him to start thinking about his past, right? Which he then kind of routes through later on his Aunt Georgiana. At the bottom paragraph on page 493. The overture closed, my aunt released my coat sleeve. She's been stirred, she's been moved. She is no longer kind of this, the equivalent of taking a red-eye flight and being kind of, red-eyed in the morning. My aunt released my coat sleeve, but she said nothing. She sat staring dully at the orchestra. What, I wondered, did she get from it? Right? So it's an attempt, what's interesting is it's this attempt to kind of sympathize or relate to the aunt, but not necessarily by asking her what she got from it. Because he doesn't say, what did you get from it, aunt? He says, and he gives us another kind of little précis about her childhood. Good pianist in her day, I could hear her singing, she told me Mozart's operas, etc., etc., etc. Then the next piece is one that we know, the prelude to Tristan and Isolde. I watched her closely through the prelude to Tristan and Isolde, trying vainly to conjecture what that seething turmoil of strings and winds might mean to her, but she sat mutely staring at the violin bows that drove obliquely downward like the peltic streaks of rain had in a summer shower. Had this music any message for her? What is he? Is he just like a bad listener? Is he just like distracted? Is he unable to listen to music and therefore just has to put it in some, terms of his family? She seems the one that's really listening to the music itself, watching the musicians play and listening to what they play. He's just, I wonder what message it had. Any music had this music any message for her? Had she enough left at all to comprehend this power, which is deeply offensive? Could she understand this music at all, which he's not comprehending its power, because he's wondering if she can comprehend its power. Had she enough left at all to comprehend this power which had kindled the world since she had left it? I was in a fever of curiosity, but Aunt Georgiana sat silent upon her beak in Darien. That's a quote from Keats's On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. So we know that this young man Clark is kind of a literary-minded fellow who wants to show that he can allude to Keats at any given moment. Fair enough. We all know Stephen Dedalus, similar kind of thing. She preserved this utter immobility throughout the number from the Flying Dutchman, though her fingers worked mechanically on her black dress, as if of themselves they were recalling the piano score they had once played. This is kind of remarkable, right? So what's happening here is that she is intensely listening and then realizing that she still remembers in the muscle memory of her fingers the song that this song that she's hearing and that she once played on the piano, right? He doesn't think, well, that's pretty amazing. He says, poor hands. They had been stretched and twisted into mere tentacles to hold and lift and knead with, on one of them a thin worn band that had once been a wedding ring. As I pressed and gently quieted one of those groping hands, I remembered, then he stops her from doing that. I remembered with quivering eyelids their services for me in other days. Then we hear another song. Her eyes were closed, but the tears were glistening on her cheeks. During the intermission, he asked her about her response, that she was weeping, and she says, I used to know someone, a German man who came to the town where I lived in Nebraska, who sang that song. So he's now licensed to really connect everything back to her childhood. Then on 495, we have the second half of the concert, which is all selections from Wagner's Ring Cycle. Okay, the 4 opera major achievement of Wagner's life. And then on 495, that paragraph, her lip quivered and she hastily put her handkerchief up to her mouth. From behind it she murmured, and you have been hearing this ever since you left me, Clark. Her question was the gentlest and saddest of reproaches, right? So for now we realize that she's realizing what she has lost, or what has been lost, right? Second half of the program, 4 numbers from the Ring. My aunt wept quietly but almost continuously as a shallow vessel overflows in a rainstorm. From time to time, her dim eyes looked up at the lights burning softly under their dull glass globes. The deluge of sound poured on and on. I never knew what she found in the shining current of it. I never knew how far it bore her, or past what happy islands. From the trembling of her face, I could well believe that before the last number, she had been carried out where the myriad graves are, into the grey, nameless burying grounds of the sea, or into some world of death vaster yet, where from the beginning of the world, hope is lain down with hope, and dream with dream, and renouncing slept. The concert was over, the people filed all to the hall, etc., etc., etc. The musicians pack up their stuff and go away. I spoke to my aunt. She burst into tears and sobbed pleadingly, "I don't want to go, Clark, I don't want to go." I understood. For just outside the concert hall lay the black pond with the cattle-track bluffs, the tall unpainted house, the weather-curled boards naked as a tower, the crook-backed ash seedlings where the dishcloths hung to dry, the gaunt, molting turkeys picking up refuse about the kitchen door. How do we understand, what do we think of this kind of triangular relationship between Clark, his aunt, and music? Both of which this entire triangle is kind of backdropped by the entire past of their lives. What do we think about Clark's simultaneous statement that he doesn't know what she was feeling and that he understood somehow?
I think I took a very sympathetic view of it towards Clark, just because the way that he was, like even the Keats quote and the way he was describing like who his aunt was to him as a child, you got the idea that he was only in Boston because of her,
Yeah.
and he was only able to take her to see the symphony because the thing, or his performance, because of the things that she had taught him. The only reason he knows Keats is because she taught it to him. So this idea of him wanting to kind of share with her, and then when he says, "I understand," I kind of, again, like I took a very sympathetic view
Good.
of that because I thought it was like he understands what it's like to come out of that isolated area and see this from the person. There's not even a piano.
Good.
And see
Good.
this huge performance and just realize, except in his case, he probably listened to that and realized he was never going home again, whereas she's listening to it and realizing she has to.
Yeah, good. That's excellent.
Yeah, I think on the one hand it could be read as like a moment of empathy for him, but it could also be him, if he doesn't say to her, "I understand," and then lets her elaborate on what she actually means, he just writes her out of it immediately and then puts his own interpretation of what she possibly is feeling on the interior onto it, which is kind of troubling.
Right. So on the one hand, we can imagine that there's this kind of act of sympathy at work. On the other hand, we can think of it as being a kind of an act of substitution or projection going on. Both of which, what's fascinating is, all of this stuff has detached itself from the music. Right? It's not about what the music's about. And Wagner's music, as we know, is about stuff. Right? It has leitmotifs, it has stories, it has characters who do stuff, right? But what's happened is that the emotional and affective relationships that these characters have with music and each other through the music is detached from the music, right? Because what we don't care about, what we don't need to know, I mean, one of the ways to understand the story would be to go through and spend a lot of time saying, okay, well, how might their relationship connect to the Tannhauser? And how might it connect to the other piece? And how might it sort of get to try to understand how the allusions to Wagner themselves function as leitmotifs for the characters. What matters is the emotional kind of world that they allow the characters to have access to, either in the sympathetic way that Tyler was describing, or in the kind of more complex or problematic way, in the way that Joshua was describing, in the way in which his voice kind of overwrites her experience by claiming at once, "I don't know what she was talking about, but I understood."
I sort of felt like it was singing through a bunch of different reflections, sort of. Like, it was a reflection of her, like, her face, her experience was reflecting the music. He was reflecting what he thought he saw in her. And then also we get, throughout the whole piece, like, basically his thoughts reflected to us of her. And I just felt like it was really interesting. To me, it felt like we were, like, filtering music through a sieve, like, through several different layers, you know, and we were
Yeah.
getting kind of like the dregs of what was left.
Yeah.
And it was more about him, I felt. I didn't necessarily feel like that was bad. It was just interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, and you know, I mean, I don't think there's. Yes, I mean, I think it's problematic, right, that she doesn't get much of a voice. it would be interesting if she did get more of a voice in the story. But yeah, I mean, what's most interesting is however, whether we kind of read it kind of sympathetically or skeptically, right? What we're watching is, I think that's right, this kind of filtering process, right, by which or through which music activates all these kinds of emotional registers in the characters, right? If we think, I mean, if then we turn to a string quartet, right, and we think about it in those terms, a much different, in certain ways, like the same thing happens. The story's about the same goddamn thing. Person goes to concert and writes words in response to music, right? This is based on, I mean, when Woolf in her diaries wrote a lot in the 20s about going to concerts, right? And she would, you know, there's a particular bit of her diary in which she talks about going to a concert and hearing Schubert's Trout Quintet, right? Which is instead of a string quartet, violin, violin, viola, cello, it's a quintet, violin, violin, viola, cello, piano. And so people have said, well, maybe she's writing about it in this piece, but the problem, right, is that we're told that it's a quartet and not a quintet, and yet there's a reference to a fish. So we've got, well, there's the Trout Quintet. In any case, I've given you the Schubert, and we're told it's Mozart, not Schubert, and I've given you that piece on B-course as well. But instead of the kind of relatively realist, or just realist, I don't know, we don't have to have relatively realist, just realist, a style of Cather's story, we get something much more modernist, angled, you know, jagged, paratactic in Woolf's story. How many people sort of wondered about Woolf's little piece, which is, you know, 4 pages long, not a big thing? I am usually flummoxed by this piece, right? I mean, it's a hard, I mean, I've read this a bunch of times, and, you know, it's a weird little piece because you never know what you're getting, right? On the one hand, I understand that we're given the kind of milieu of the concert. So when we get these broken snatches of dialogue, of conversation that don't go together, like on the first page of the story, 7 years since we met, the last time in Venice, and where are you living now? Well, the late afternoon suits me the best, though, if it weren't asking too much. What we know is that we don't really have a narrator so much as we have a kind of selective narrative recording device that is picking up, or, you know, not literally, but kind of giving us snatches of conversations from around the people who are milling about the concert and getting ready to sit down. So, and this is a much more modernist kind of style, and it's a very Woolfian kind of style. So if you read Mrs. Dalloway or other Woolf novels, this probably feels a bit more familiar, okay? One of the weirdest things about this story, though, is what happens when the music actually starts, right? The first page is really everyone kind of getting ready for the concert. And then, well,
the language tries to do the work of the orchestra.
yeah, I mean, this is the strangest thing. So we have this. So we're alternating between like various people talking, and we know that they're not talking to one another because their conversations don't really make sense, right? As you know, so we have that kind of you know, kind of overheard conversation, and then we have these descriptive passages by some kind of unknown narrator figure. There's no kind of, the narrator is clearly kind of a character in the scene because she or he must be at the concert in order to hear this, but the narrator really doesn't have any self. There's no sense in which, like, there's a Clark here, you know, centering the story. So this, on page 139, the strangest bit, and we can just focus on this because another thing is that I think this is this is a 4-page story that has kind of tons to work with. It would be a great piece to write about, because one of the things that you really want to do when you kind of write about this piece, and the Cather piece differently and things, is tracking the sentence to sentence and even phrase to phrase movement of the piece is utterly fascinating, right? So more than saying kind of what is the theme or whatever, just like figuring out what the hell happens from sentence to sentence is an unbelievably difficult but really kind of fascinating task. So we'll look primarily at the one paragraph on 139, but know that this kind of reading could be expanded over the course of the whole 4 pages, right? so they got, we got some more conversation on the bottom of 138, 139. The treaty that's being referred to at the beginning, if indeed they say the treaty is signed, that's the Treaty of Versailles, right, in 1919, that kind of brings a formal end to the war. So we have a kind of an immediate post-war, World War I moment, okay? On the contrary, oh wait, so she's bought a house at Malmesbury. How lucky to find one, kind of chatter, chatter, chatter. On the contrary, it seems to be pretty sure that she, whoever she may be, is damned, since it's all a matter of flats and hats and seagulls. So it seems to be for 100 people sitting here well-dressed, walled in, furred, replete. So we have a kind of a narrator who, we've all been this person at a party. Like, jerks. But here, and then you realize, like, oh shit, I'm here. And I'm like a stupid jerk too, right? Not that I can boast, since I too sit passive on a gilt chair, only turning the earth above a buried memory, as we all do, for there are signs, if I'm not mistaken, that we're all recalling something, furtively seeking something. Why fidget? Why so anxious about the sit of cloaks and gloves, whether to button or unbutton? Then watch that elderly face against the dark canvas, a moment ago urbane and flushed, now taciturn and sad, as if in shadow. Was it the sound of the second violin tuning in the anteroom? And this is fascinating, because this is based on a bit of knowledge. There's no way you would, so the first violin is like the lead guitar, and the second violin is like the other person, right? Like like not the main, not the backup, the rhythm, whatever you call it. So the first violin and the second violin, there's no way that you would know who the first violin and who the second violin is when they're still backstage, right? And so we have this this is an unaccounted bit of knowledge. Like, oh, maybe it's the second violin tuning up that's making this face that she's looking at seem sad. There's no way anyone could know who the second violin is because they haven't come out on stage yet. Here they come, 4 black figures carrying instruments, and seat themselves facing the white squares, their music, under the downpour of light. Rest the tips of their bows on the music stand, with a simultaneous movement, lift them, lightly poise them, and looking across the player opposite, the first violin counts 1, 2, 3. Does anyone know Serena Lee? Graduate student? She's a great graduate student. Her theory, that she's a violinist, is that this is the piece that they listen to. This is an early Mozart quartet, right? Okay, right? And I mean, so we don't know exactly what she's like, we're not told. But what happens is, whatever that piece of music is, what we get is not music, but this amazingly detailed scene, which, whether it's this piece or not, we're doing that kind of impossible Hanslickian thing. That this piece of music, somehow, is able to be translated into flourish, spring, burgeon, burst, the pear tree on the top of the mountain, fountains jet, drops descend, but the waters of the Rhone flow swift and deep, race under the arches and sweep the trailing water leaves, washing shadows over the silver fish. The spotted fish rush down by the swift waters, now swept into an eddy where it's difficult this conglomeration of fish all in a pool, leaping, splashing, scraping sharp fins, and etc., etc. What is the status of this paragraph? What is it? It seems to be taking place maybe in the mind of a character when this music is playing, or some other kind of Mozart quartet. And we don't know what Mozart quartet this is. But how is this different, say, than Clark's feelings during the Wagner tunes? This paragraph right here. What did you do with this? When you're like, okay, the music's gonna start, first violin counts 1, 2, 3, and then you get this other paragraph that's about like fish.
I think what Clark does is dilute the actual reception of the music, which is something that is very much present in the last piece, that we just don't really pay attention to because we're focusing on how he's receiving it. But here it's like almost like completely countering that there's no prototype in nature. It's like here is nature. Here's nature and music and all of these things, and it's a direct feeling that's being put down.
That's fantastic. So it's in a weird way, it's like if Wolf knew Hanslick, She was doubling down on arguing with him
Yeah.
by saying, yes, music has no prototype in nature, but here, I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you a literary response to music that is itself a natural description.
I've been very upset about this no prototype in nature thing. Like, did you know that spiders sing to each other before mating?
No.
It's
I don't listen to spiders all that. Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, it's a great argument because, like, what I mean, who hears birdsong and says, "What shitty noise is that?" Right? Like, that's great. Listen to some birdsong. So we imagine that's music of a sort. So, like,
mating calls, but like, what if music for humans is a mating call?
right. So I mean, yeah.
Concern ourselves.
Right, and so we get this problem of, like, if there's no prototype of, if music has no prototype in nature, then how did this happen? How did this happen? Like, why is somehow this piece moved to write about mountains and waters flowing and the fish in them?
Or even the other one uses the water metaphor.
Yeah.
You know, so previously you have like these sort of like variations on a theme where he's either imagining his aunt as like this quote unquote shallow vessel, you know, that's filling up with water, or the sea and all these islands, you know, so there's these sort of like shallows and then these incredible depths that he's juxtaposing. But then here you also get water, but then you get fish and streams and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So they're using similar metaphors, but it does seem like they're reacting with this like naturalist imagery.
Yeah, I mean, and the water is like, you know, water flows, water has a rhythm, water has a sound. You know, like water is the easiest of the kind of prototypes in nature to link to music, right? Because it's both temporal and I mean, what is the temporality of a mountain that a human could understand? Like, we know that it has a geologic temporality, but I can't say, oh yeah, I feel that, right? Whereas with music, with water, you understand that there is a kind of temporality there, the rhythm of the waves or the rhythm of the river flowing or whatever else it is. And so it's clear like why water is always like in the same way that the painting that in the other story, Cather describes the opening when they all go there in terms of like color and painting. Water becomes another kind of way to kind of bridge the gap between nature or reality and music, which, you know, depending on whether we think Hanslick is interesting or not, has no prototype in nature or does, right?
I thought it was interesting because it seemed like Clark's metaphor really fit here. Because he says that seeing people go to the symphony is like an impressionist painting, and then this description is very much evokes the idea of an impressionist painting for me. I was literally like picturing the Monet water lily scene, like looking at this description, even though it doesn't quite fit, but just like that idea was very similar.
Yeah, like, I mean, right. So on the one hand, like if we thought about this as a certain kind of impressionism, a literary impressionism, a kind of scene painting, right? Then the kind of figure that we would want to go to is someone like Debussy, right? Because he was much closer to kind of a musical impressionist than say someone like Mozart, right? And so what's happening is, I mean, I think that's a fascinating point. But if I played this music and said, okay, everyone write a paragraph, we could have 70 different paragraphs, right? And so what has happened at an even more like intensified level, I think, or one of the ways to read the story, not the only way, is that at a more intensified level, we might say that Woolf is doing the thing that Keats realizes he has to do in Ode to a Nightingale, right? In Ode to a Nightingale, there's a kind of giving up of the nightingale's own difference, right? Did I wake or sleep? Fled is that music? What Ode to the Nightingale kind of, what the speaker kind of realizes at the end of the poem is that there's kind of this difference between the music of the nightingale and whatever poetry the poet's going to make, right? This massive difference is exactly what Shelley was trying to overcome, what Wordsworth kind of pretended didn't exist, right? What Dickinson was trying to overcome in a different way. What's happening, I think, one of the things that's happening in a string quartet is that this is a piece of literature about a piece of music, or about the experience of listening to a piece of music, that really has in which what we don't get any attempt to kind of bring the two together, right? Because you know, this could exist on its own, this description of the fish and thing, but we get kind of two totally different, what we get is absolute difference between the music that's being heard and the response in words that is being written down. Brooke, did you ever?
Oh no, just not in my head.
Oh, okay. So what's, so instead of it being the music becoming kind of a relay for Clark between, his own listening and his memories of his childhood, there is no connection here, right? It's wonderful. It's a fantastic reformulation of what the music is doing in that one case, right? But it'd be very hard for me to say anything like, well, it is a description of the music, or it is a translation of the music, or it is a rendering of the music into words or images, right? What remains is sort of that kind of, I remain flummoxed by, well, how do we get from the violinist going 1, 2, 3 to flourish, spring, burgeon, burst, and all of that, and then what happens over the rest of the kind of piece is similar kind of alternations between the social fabric, the social scene, people talking to each other, right, and these kind of idiosyncratic and internalized descriptions of what the music is. The paragraph on page 140, the melancholy river bears us on. Clearly, if I started that piece again, and I said, the melancholy river bears us on. When the moon comes through the trailing willow boughs, I see your face. That doesn't really go with this music, right? In certain ways we kind of feel that, but there's nothing, it feels a certain, oh, well, that doesn't really go with the music, so it must be another piece. Another piece of music is being played that somehow is meant to accompany, or that this accompanies the passage on the top of 140. Right? And so one of the things that we can never quite do, and one of the things that actually doesn't matter at all, is what piece of music is actually being alluded to. What we care less about, ultimately, after this piece, is whatever piece of music Woolf was kind of imagining or remembering as he wrote this piece. Because what the piece is ultimately kind of about is this absolute difference between the piece of music and any kind of literary representative rendering of that piece. Right? And so what's interesting is just this act of listening that happens in these texts. And what I want to do, we have 1 minute left, so let me just say what I want to do. In many ways, the Mallarmé and the Stravinsky go well together because, unlike the Mozart here, they are both very much programmed music. Obviously, I'd like you to listen to the Mallarmé. It's about 12 minutes long. If you've read the Mallarmé poem, great. If you haven't, give that a quick read. It's 100 lines long. There's a couple things I want to say. One of the most fascinating questions is about the relationship between the poem written by Mallarmé and published in 1876 and the piece of music first performed by, written by Debussy and first performed in 1893. So the piece of music post-dates the poem. But the piece of music also is a prelude to the poem, so it comes before the poem. So it is both before the poem and after the poem. Okay? At the same time, there are the exact same number of measures of music in the piece as there are lines of poetry in the poem. So it is the poem and replicates the poem, right? And so one of the interesting questions is what is the relationship between these two pieces which have a definite relation to one another, right? This isn't just, we don't have something pretty unmoored here. We have something quite definite, okay? And I guess the final question, and we'll start here for about a few minutes on Wednesday, and then we'll turn to Stravinsky. Listen, when you read the poem and have a sense of what the poem is about, and it's a very difficult poem, okay, but it's based on the Pan and Syrinx myth in Ovid. When you read the poem and then listen to the music, are you hearing the poem in the music? What is your experience of listening to this music in relation to the poem that you know is about something? Right? And I think this presents a remarkable problem, because the music lets us listen in a way in which we don't have to be kind of responsible to what the poem is about, right?
I read it before, but I think it's been long enough to where it would feel new if I read it again.
Okay.
Would you prefer us to listen to the music first?
Read the poem. It doesn't matter. Do whatever way you want, but just try to get a sense of what is the relationship, what does the music let you do in terms of responding to the poem that the poem kind of didn't let you do. Okay, that's not a good way to say it, but what the point is, we'll start with Mallarmé Debussy for about 10 minutes, and then run over to Stravinsky, and we'll go from there. Thanks, everyone.